Award-winning documentary filmmaker Rory Kennedy has directed and produced more than 24 films in her career, most focused on some of the most pressing political and social issues of our time. In Last Days in Vietnam, she explored the U.S. evacuation of Saigon. In The Fence, she dug into the real consequences of the U.S.-Mexico border. And in Ghosts of Abu Ghraib, she examined the 2004 U.S. torture scandal in Iraq. But now she's diving into a whole new genre. Take Every Wave, the life of Laird Hamilton, chronicles the unorthodox life of a man who's refused to compete in professional surfing, but has dominated and changed the sport like no one else.
I mean, when I look at my life and I look at what surfing has brought me, it's worth everything. It gives you a reason to be here. It brings you fulfillment. It teaches you courage and fear and respect.
I sat down with Rory Kennedy last weekend to talk more about the film and the man behind it. This was right after the vote to expel Harvey Weinstein from the Motion Picture Academy. Rory serves on the board, but before results were announced.
Rory, it's great to see you again. Thanks so much. So I have no interest in surfing. I have no interest in surfing movies. I watch Endless Summer because you have to. So help me understand why I was transfixed by this movie. What was that about?
Well, I'm in the same boat.
You are?
Excuse my phrase, but the story really drew me in because of Laird. It's a great character portrait. And I think that he has something important to say that transcends surfing. This is a guy who has done everything and put everything aside to pursue his dream.
Yeah, but there's so many amazing things. And by the way, he is almost like a typecast for this. He could be in a movie about him if he were not him, if you get what I'm saying. I'm sure you're going to raise up. So it appears to me he doesn't enter competition because he has fear of losing or of judgment, but he apparently has no fear of dying. Is that not a fair characterization of this man?
Well, Laird is probably the most competitive person I know, and I know a lot of really competitive people. So I think his aversion to competition is really about the judgment. He's very happy to compete in a race where there's, a finish line and whoever crosses first wins. What he doesn't like is these guys sitting on the side of the beach saying you're good and you're not good and the waves and it's all arbitrary. So I think, he is drawn to this more than anybody I know in terms of having a single focus in his life.
I know I read you moved from Brooklyn to California. Another thing is not understandable to me, but that's for another day. So would you have made this had you not done the California move?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, we moved to Los Angeles, and we lived down the street from Laird.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, so I was aware of Laird, over the years. I had met him a few times. While we were there was a huge surf one year, and he shot the pier, the Malibu pier, which means he surfed through underneath the pier, right? So he kind of was on all of our radar, and then I was approached to make a documentary about him. And I wasn't actually interested in making one because I thought it was going to be a typical surf film, which I was not interested in, even though I love those. What I was interested in, here's a guy who has pushed the human limits, his own limits, constantly, and has transformed the sport single-handedly.
Were you nervous about this? I mean, last time we were together, you'd done Last Days of Vietnam, which was Oscar nominated, which was brilliant, Ghosts of Abu Ghraib. I mean, on and on, almost all about social issues and things that are very different from this. Were you nervous making this transition to something that is so, at least to me, so totally different from what you've done in the past?
Well, I was excited about it, frankly, and that was part of the reason that I was drawn to it as well, is that it was going to be a new challenge for me. How do you film a guy on an 80-foot wave? What does that look like? Do we use drones? Do we use jet skis?
And how did you? That was my next question. So how did you do that? I mean, it is. I don't want to give the end. I'm not giving it away. That sequence that goes on forever is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's just him, I can say, right?
Yeah.
Moving across the surface of the water, well, above the surface of the water, actually, in the most beautiful, it's magical. I mean, how did you know what the hell you're doing?
Thank you. Well, so I decided that it was really best to shoot him from a helicopter. And it's interesting with big waves because you can shoot a huge wave, and if you're at a certain angle, it can look really small. And what I determined was that it's actually the best place to shoot a big wave is underneath the wave, you know, from below the wave, and from a helicopter, because with the foil boarding, he moves so fast and so far that you can't really keep up with him in any other capacity. The problem is, to really get that angle, the helicopter has to be below the wave. Right? So there are a number of angles in that last shot where we're actually looking up at Laird, and there's water coming into the helicopter. So I was
nervous laughter, I assume.
I was somewhat petrified myself. But then you look at Laird and you figure, if he can do that, I should be able to do that.
You know, everything I've ever seen of yours, there's a takeaway. And I generally had a feeling that I knew from having seen it, even before I met you, what the takeaway was. What's the takeaway here? I assume there is one. Is there not? It's not just a story of, I mean, stories of people who are the best who ever lived at their particular craft are thrilling to me anyway. But is there more here?
Well, I think that's a huge part of the takeaway, and why I wanted to tell this story is the story of somebody pushing their limits and occupying that space of uncomfortableness for their entire lives, and you know, what you learn from that space. But, you know, on the other hand, it's also the story of a guy who grew up in poverty, who grew up with a broken home, who had a dream and followed it and made a life for himself, you know, in so doing. And I think that there's value in witnessing that. I think, you know, to me, it's also an inspiring story to see somebody push those limits so much. We had a screening the other day, and somebody said to me, you know, after watching the film, I've been terrified of the ocean, and I've never even been able to touch it. And after watching this film, I'm going to go in and dunk my head under. You know, so I'm not saying everybody should go surf an 80-foot wave, but I do think part of the idea behind the film is that we're more capable than what we think, and that we can push ourselves into areas that we didn't think was possible.
And God, does he ever do that? His wife says that beautifully, by the way, throughout the... Can we talk current events for a couple of minutes while you're here? Harvey Weinstein. What was your... I mean, you're in the industry. So many people are now saying this is not aberrational. These are open secrets. There are a lot of Harvey Weinsteins, even if he may be worse than others. Is that true?
You know, listen, I mean, I think with Harvey Weinstein, there was a sense, I think there was an understanding in Hollywood that he had affairs, that, you know, he would pursue women. I think the fact that he was raping women was not known widely. Certainly, I didn't know that, and that he was as predatory in his actions as we now know that he was. And I think that is, I don't think, you know, I think that is really on the extreme margins of the industry and of life and the world, you know. I mean, it's horrific and disturbing, and you know, I find it very upsetting, and I think it does speak to some issues that we have in Hollywood as an industry, and I think that it's an opportunity, in my mind, to try to dig into those a bit more, and I think that my hope is that we'll start doing that.
Another current event issue, you did a movie, I think maybe 8 or 10 years ago. It was called The Fence. Am I right?
I did.
About the border fence.
Yes.
And I actually saw it at the time. And when you were coming in, I was thinking about it. I've spoken to a lot of Democratic elected officials from Massachusetts, senators and congresspeople from Massachusetts, who have no appetite for a wall. But when I've asked them about whether or not they'd vote for funding for a wall, each one of them, without one exception, has said if it was part of a larger, more comprehensive immigration fix, we'd consider it. Do you have any guidance to offer them based upon your experience making this film?
Well, listen, I mean, the fence as we have it is pretty close to useless and costs taxpayers billions of dollars. You know, as we document in the film, the people go under it, they climb over it, they drive cars over it. You know, it's penetratable because it's now 700 miles of a 2,000-mile border. They also simply go down the street and walk around it. It's a very complicated initiative on that border, and I've spent a lot of time there geographically because it's going through deserts, it's going over mountains, it's following the Rio Grande River. It's a lot of the border. And so then you have to figure out, well, are you going to make a fence that goes around the border and goes, or are you going to build the fence north of the Rio Grande River, and then that becomes a dead zone, which has happened. And so there's many stories where, you know, people would have their property on the north side of the fence, their house maybe, but maybe their cattle was on the south side of the fence. You know, it's enormously complicated, and it doesn't really work as an idea. It's one of those things that I think sounds great, but in the application of it, it's very hard to make it actually work and function.
Last thing, since you mentioned Congress, I just thought, when I met you, I'm sure you have this experience almost every time someone meets you, they say to you how much they admired your father, as I did, and you didn't get to meet him. I got to see him on a street corner in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Your nephew, who's a fairly regular participant in the show, Congressman Joe Kennedy, was on, I don't know, about 6 months ago, and I told him I just read Larry Tye's book about your father, which I thought was spectacular, and I asked him if he had read it. And he said he hadn't read it, and he had no intention of ever reading it. He just couldn't deal with it. Have you? I
haven't read it. No, you know, I think for our family, it's hard to revisit some of these ideas and these moments that, you know, are both, I mean, obviously extraordinary and moments that we're enormously proud of, but then it also raises times that are difficult and painful. And so I think, you know, everybody deals with that in different ways, and some of us just avoid spending a lot of time going back in history. And I think also one of the values that, you know, we learn from a very young age in our family is to live in the present and to try to make the future as good for people in this world as possible. And so I think, you know, we tend to look forward and not back so much.
Your film is terrific, Rory. It's great to see you again.
Thank you.
Lots of luck with it.
It's great to see you. Nice talking.
Take Every Wave, The Life of Laird Hamilton is showing now at the Kendall Square Cinema in Cambridge. You can find more information about the movie at takeeverywave.com.